the megalithic network. The day gravity became optional. Picture a modern construction site. Cranes tower overhead like steel giraffes, cables hum under tension. Engineers in hard hats argue over millimeters, because millimeters matter when things weigh this much. Concrete pours are calculated. Wind speed is monitored. Every lift is rehearsed, simulated, ensured. Now pause that image and replace it with this one. An ancient hillside, no cranes, no steel cables, no engines, no wheels, sometimes not even pack animals. Just stone. Single blocks weighing hundreds of tons, sometimes over 1,000, lifted, moved, placed, with gaps so tight you can't slide a sheet of paper between them. These stones aren't impressive because they're old. They're impressive because we still struggle to move things like this today. I know what you're thinking. They must have used ramps, lots of manpower. Time makes everything possible. Maybe, but here's where the bedtime story starts to feel off. Because when modern engineers look at these sites, really look, they don't say, "Ah yes, brute force." They say, "How?" Not rhetorically, technically. How do you move a 1,200-ton block without fracturing it? How do you lift it without leaving tool marks? How do you set it down with sub-millimeter precision on uneven terrain? And then you realize something even stranger. This isn't one site. It's not one culture's lucky breakthrough. The same engineering miracle appears again and again. In Lebanon, in England, in Peru, in Egypt. Across continents, across thousands of years. Different mythologies, different languages, different belief systems. Same problem, same solution, and that's the paradox. If this were trial and error, we'd expect variation, different methods, different levels of success, but what we see instead is consistency. As if the builders weren't improvising. As if they weren't inventing the solution from scratch each time, as if they were following instructions. Now stay with me because this matters more than it sounds. When modern engineers build something extreme, they don't rely on folklore. They rely on methods. Shared knowledge. Standards. If those methods disappeared, and someone centuries later tried to recreate the structure by guessing, it wouldn't look like this. It would look messy, approximate, inconsistent. But these sites don't look guessed. They look executed, almost like gravity was treated less as a law, and more as a suggestion. And here's the quiet detail people rarely talk about. Many of these stones are made of materials that are notoriously difficult to work with. Granite, diorite, basalt. Materials that laugh at copper tools. Yet the cuts are clean, the joints are precise, the fits are intentional, no excess. No correction marks. Which brings us back to the central question, asked softly, without accusation. What if ancient builders weren't solving the same impossible problem over and over? What if they already knew the answer? What if they were part of a network not political, not cultural, but technical? A shared understanding of how to move the unmovable. And what if that understanding didn't belong entirely to them? Let that sit for a moment. Because once you accept that gravity might not have been the biggest challenge these builders faced, the real mystery isn't how the stones were moved. It's who taught them that they could be. When weight becomes a clue. Before we speculate, let's slow down and meet the stones themselves. Not as symbols. Not as legends. As objects. Because stones don't exaggerate. They don't mythologize themselves. They just sit there, patiently waiting for us to explain how they got where they are. We'll start with 3 sites on 3 different continents that quietly share the same problem. Site A, Baalbek, Lebanon. In the ancient city of Baalbek sits a Roman temple complex. Impressive, yes, but not the most interesting part. Beneath it lie 3 stones known as the trilithon. Each weighs somewhere between 800 and 1,000 tons. To put that in perspective, modern cranes struggle with loads a fraction of that size. Moving one of these stones today would require custom equipment, reinforced roads, and months of planning. These stones were quarried, transported, lifted, and placed with precision. And then, centuries later, the Romans arrived. Here's the detail that doesn't get enough attention. The Romans didn't move these stones. They built on top of them, like inheriting a foundation they didn't understand. Roman engineers were masters of logistics. They documented everything. If they had moved the trilithon, they would have bragged about it. They didn't. They accepted the stones as given. Ask yourself, gently, why would one of the most accomplished engineering cultures in history choose not to replicate or relocate stones like these? Why treat them as immovable facts? Site B, Stonehenge, England. Now shift to a very different landscape. Rolling plains, wind, rain. Stonehenge doesn't overwhelm with size the way Baalbek does. Its stones are smaller, but the effort involved is just as puzzling. Some of the stones were transported from hundreds of kilometers away, not downhill, not by river alone. Across terrain that would challenge modern logistics without paved roads. And then there's the alignment. Stonehenge isn't random. It marks solstices, tracks lunar cycles, encodes time. And it wasn't built once. It was rebuilt, revised, adjusted, maintained over generations, which raises a quiet question. Why go through all this trouble for rocks, not for shelter? Not for defense, not for burial, for alignment, for precision, for timing. Stonehenge behaves less like a monument and more like a calibration device. And that's odd for a culture without writing. Site C, Puma Punku, Bolivia. Now let's go to the Andes. High altitude. Thin air, extreme weather. At Puma Punku, part of the Tiwanaku complex, stones lie scattered as if the site was dismantled mid-thought. The stones themselves are the shock. They're cut like Lego blocks, flat faces, right angles, grooves and channels that interlock. The tolerances are so tight that modern stonemasons shake their heads. And here's the kicker. There was no written language, no iron tools, no evidence of wheeled transport. Yet the geometry demands advanced measurement. These stones don't look carved, they look manufactured, as if shaped by a process, not by hand. Now step back. 3 sites, different continents, different climates, different cultures. Same traits, stones too heavy to explain easily, precision too fine to dismiss casually, purpose too unclear to label symbolic. And perhaps the strangest commonality of all, none of these cultures left instructions. No manuals, no diagrams, no explanations, just the stones. Which leaves us standing in front of them, thousands of years later, asking the same childlike question over and over. How did you do this? And more importantly, why did you all do it the same way? Because coincidence might explain one site, it doesn't explain a pattern. And patterns, especially heavy ones, have a habit of pointing towards something we haven't named yet. Something shared, something taught, or something remembered. Couldn't they just use lots of people? This is the moment when the most common explanation clears its throat. They used slave labor. They used ramps. They had time. Lots of it, fair enough. Human beings can accomplish astonishing things when there are enough of them, and enough years to burn. So let's grant that premise. Let's imagine thousands of workers. Generations of effort, endless hauling, pulling, lifting, adjusting. Now comes the part where the explanation has to keep up. Because once you accept brute force, you also accept brute evidence. Where are the ramps? Not symbolic ones. Not hypothetical sketches. Physical remains. For Baalbek, moving 1,000-ton stones would require ramps longer than football fields, reinforced to withstand pressure that would cause collapse. Those ramps would leave scars. They'd reshape the landscape. They'd show up in soil layers. They'd leave debris. They don't. Now ask another quiet question. Why move stones heavier than needed? If the goal was symbolism, ritual, or display, smaller stones would do. Many cultures achieved grandeur without flirting with structural impossibility. But these builders didn't choose big, they chose maximal, which brings us to precision. Symbolic monuments don't require sub-millimeter tolerances. Ritual spaces don't need interlocking joints so tight that blades of grass can't slip between them. And yet these sites insist on precision. Not artistic precision, engineering precision. Now you might be thinking, enough people can do anything. True, but enough people usually leave a mess. Crude tool marks, asymmetries, corrections, compromises. These sites don't look like that. They don't look improvised. They don't look overworked. They look overqualified. As if the builders weren't struggling against physics, but working around it. This is where the explanation starts to feel thin. Brute force explains effort. It doesn't explain restraint, because when something is truly difficult, people simplify. They reduce tolerances. They accept errors. They make things good enough. These sites refuse good enough. They go beyond what's necessary for meaning and land squarely in the realm of capability. So we're left with an uncomfortable question. Why build at the limits of physics? If physics isn't the point, why treat stone like something malleable? Why prioritize exact fit over speed? Why repeat the same improbable solutions across continents? At this point, the issue isn't whether ancient people were capable. The issue is whether they were guessing, because guessing looks messy. This doesn't. This looks like execution, and execution usually follows a plan. Which raises the question we keep circling. If these builders weren't discovering methods through trial and error, then who showed them what was possible? And why did that knowledge arrive already knowing how to behave? We're not answering that yet. But we're allowed to admit something. Lots of people explains strength. It doesn't explain elegance. And elegance in engineering usually means one thing. Someone already knew the solution. Different cultures. Same trick. This is where the story changes speed. Because once you accept that these sites aren't crude, accidental, or symbolic, once you accept that they're overqualified, the question stops being how hard the work was and becomes how consistent it was. Different cultures, different continents, different belief systems, same results. Let's start with the cuts. At sites like Baalbek, Giza, and Puma Punku, stones made of granite and diorite are shaped with precision that shouldn't be possible using copper tools and brute force alone. Diorite is brutally hard. Granite doesn't forgive mistakes. Yet we see perfect right angles, flat surfaces spanning meters. Joints so tight they appear fused. These aren't approximations. They're deliberate. My translation: you don't get this by hammering harder. You get this by changing the rules of the material. And here's where the legends stop sounding childish and start sounding procedural. Across cultures, there are stories of stones becoming soft. Not metaphorically, literally. In the Andes, legends speak of stones that could be shaped like clay. In Egypt, texts hint at stone being made to flow. In other traditions, sound, chant, or vibration is involved. These stories are usually dismissed as myth. But what if they aren't trying to entertain? What if they're trying poorly to describe a process? This is where we introduce an idea gently, without demanding belief. The stone softening hypothesis. The idea that stone wasn't lifted in its rigid state. That its properties were temporarily altered through sound, vibration, resonance, or another method we no longer understand, not permanently changed. Just persuaded. Ask yourself this. If you could soften stone even slightly, if friction dropped, if weight became manageable, everything changes. You don't need massive ramps. You don't need armies of laborers. You need control. Now, let's talk about sound. Explain this like you're 5. Sound isn't just noise, it's movement. It's vibration traveling through matter. Strong sound can move objects. Certain frequencies can make things shake, shift, or even float. This isn't fantasy. In laboratories today, acoustic levitation uses sound waves to suspend small objects in midair. Not magic. Physics. Now scale that idea up. Different materials respond differently to vibration. Certain frequencies can change how rigid something behaves. My line: if you can tune a wine glass to shatter, why not tune stone to cooperate? We're not claiming ancient people had speakers and oscilloscopes. We're asking whether they discovered or were shown how to use resonance in ways that don't survive well in the archaeological record. Sound leaves no fossils. Neither does knowledge passed orally, ritually, or experientially. Now pull back. Look at the global pattern again. These sites share impossible stonework, astronomical alignments, geometric obsession, locations tied to Earth's energy features. This isn't random. This isn't parallel invention. This is method, and methods spread differently than ideas. You don't reinvent a tuning fork everywhere on Earth. You copy it. At some point, coincidence becomes choreography. And choreography implies coordination. Which brings us to the question history avoids because it's uncomfortable, not because it's ridiculous. What if these cultures weren't independently discovering how to do the impossible, but were taught the same trick, not through textbooks, not through blueprints, but through demonstration? Should, don't tell. A technique that works beautifully, but only while the teacher is present. And once the teacher leaves, all that remains are the stones. Immovable again, uncooperative, silent. That's why later cultures struggled to replicate the feats. That's why the knowledge didn't propagate. It wasn't lost. It was never fully owned. And that realization shifts the entire conversation. Because if stone once obeyed rules we no longer remember, then the past wasn't primitive. It was conditioned. Which leaves us with a final unsettling thought before we move on. If someone or something knew how to persuade stone to move, What else did they know how to persuade? Not monuments, but interfaces. Once you stop seeing these sites as isolated achievements, something subtle begins to happen. They start talking to each other. Not through stories or inscriptions, but through placement, through alignment, through repetition, through restraint. What if Baalbek, Stonehenge, Puma Punku, Giza, and countless lesser-known sites weren't standalone monuments, but parts of something larger? Not a political empire, not a shared religion, a network, a grid, a system that uses the planet itself as a component. This isn't as strange as it sounds. We build networks today that only make sense when viewed together. A single cell tower is unimpressive. A single satellite does nothing alone, but together, they change how the world behaves. Now imagine thinking at that scale, without modern technology, but with deep understanding of Earth, its vibrations, its magnetic fields, its resonant frequencies. Ancient builders consistently chose geologically active locations, astronomically significant positions, places where land, water, and sky intersect. That's not convenience, that's selection. So what might this network have done? Let's offer possibilities, without insisting on answers. One possibility is energy stabilization. Not electricity as we know it, but balancing planetary forces. Like tuning an instrument so it doesn't drift out of harmony. Another is communication. Not radio signals, but synchronization. Sites that know when others are active through shared resonance. Think less telephone, more heartbeat. There's also Earth-sky synchronization. Aligning human activity with celestial cycles. Seasons. Precession. Long arcs of time that matter for agriculture, climate, or something deeper. And then there's the strangest possibility of all, consciousness amplification. Places where sound, geometry, and material come together to alter perception. Not to impress gods, but to allow humans to experience something beyond ordinary awareness. Not worship. Interface. Which brings us to the question that feels dangerous to ask, because it rearranges everything. What if these weren't monuments to gods, but instruments for them? Not shrines, tools, used by beings who didn't leave bodies behind. Used briefly, used carefully, then left behind silent, heavy, inscrutable. We keep asking, why would ancient people do this? But maybe that's the wrong subject. Maybe the real question is, who were these structures designed to serve? And if they weren't designed for us, what does it mean that we're still standing among them, trying to remember how to listen? The manual that never existed. This is the question that won't leave us alone. If ancient builders really knew how to move the unmovable, if they understood stone, sound, geometry, and earth in ways that still puzzle us, why don't we inherit the instructions? Where are the manuals, the diagrams, the training halls, the step-by-step how-to carved into stone? They're not missing. They were never there. And that absence matters. Because knowledge doesn't usually vanish by accident. It vanishes when the system that holds it disappears. So let's sit with the possibilities, without rushing to judgment. One answer is catastrophe. Floods, earthquakes, climate collapse, impacts. Events big enough to erase cultures faster than stone can remember them. Knowledge passed orally is especially fragile. Once the people are gone, the knowing goes with them. That explanation works to a point. But catastrophe alone doesn't explain selective survival. The stones remain. The techniques don't. Another possibility is deliberate shutdown. Not destruction, but withdrawal. If these structures were part of a system, that system may have been intentionally turned off. Not violently, quietly. When you decommission something sensitive, you don't blow it up. You disconnect it. You leave the shell intact, but remove the understanding. Which brings us to a third idea, restricted knowledge. What if the methods were never widely known? What if only a small priest-engineer class understood how things worked, while the broader population provided labor, ritual, and meaning? When that class disappears, the civilization continues. But the capability doesn't. History is full of moments like that. Lost crafts, forgotten techniques. Things we still can't fully reproduce today. And then there's the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the builders weren't meant to stay? Not conquerors, not rulers, visitors, teachers who demonstrated what was possible, but didn't intend to babysit the outcome. In that case, no manuals make sense. You don't leave a user manual behind if you don't expect the next user to need one. Or worse, if you don't expect them to use it unsupervised. So the knowledge disappears not because it failed, but because it was never fully handed over. And what remains are the stones. Massive, precise, silent, waiting. This is where the story shifts from engineering to inheritance. Because losing knowledge doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means being left with results you can no longer explain. And when that happens, cultures don't stop building. They reinterpret. They mythologize. They ritualize. They tell stories around the thing they no longer understand. Which sets the stage for the final turn of this chapter. Because once you accept that knowledge can be shown, not given, that techniques can be demonstrated, not transferred, you're left with one last very childlike question. If the stones remember something we don't, what were they trying to teach us before the lesson ended? The stones as teachers. Let's make this small again. Imagine you build something so strong that it survives everyone who made it. The language fades. The stories disappear. The names are forgotten. But the thing still works. It still stands. Still aligns. Still behaves the way it was designed to behave. That's what these stones feel like. Not monuments meant to impress us. Lessons meant to wait for us. Maybe these stones weren't built to impress us. Maybe they were built to outlast us. Until we were ready to ask the right questions. Because stone is patient. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain itself. It just keeps doing what it was shaped to do. And across the planet, these structures keep doing something. Aligning with the sky, holding impossible weight, refusing to collapse into randomness. They don't shout. They hum. If physical tools existed, if global systems were built, if stone itself was persuaded to cooperate, then the next question isn't about materials anymore. It's about mind. Because what if the most important message wasn't carved into rock, but encoded into consciousness? Into how humans learn to see the world. Into how we learn to listen. Whether the megalithic network was a machine, a message, or a memory, it leaves us with a strange realization. Our ancestors didn't just look at the earth. They tuned it. And we're still living inside the echo.